Brilliant. I'm just going to give it just maybe one more minute while people are still coming through, and then we'll make a start.
Okay, whilst we're waiting, can I just ask something? Do we need to have Slido open? Or do
No,
we?
so we'll be using Slido, and I'll go through how we use it in a minute.
Fine.
But you'll need a smartphone or probably a tablet to access it.
Okay, that's fine.
But if there are any issues with it today, then there is the chat bar and things. But I'll go through that in a minute.
Yes, great.
Okay, so I think it's 2 minutes past, so I'm going to make a start. So hello everyone, and a really warm welcome to North Norfolk District Council's Environment Forum. We were so encouraged that so many people wanted to join us today. So for those of you who haven't yet met me, my name is Annie Samazi, and I'm the Environmental Policy Officer at North Norfolk District Council, and I started in post in December last year. And I lead the council's climate change and environment team. And I'm really lucky to be joined in our team by our climate change officer, Nigel Stannett, who you will hear from later today, and who also started working at the council at the end of last year. Due to the unprecedented events of 2020, it has been a while since the Environment Forum have met, and this year, obviously, for the first time, we meet in a digital format, which we really hope can remain as inclusive as the preceding events have been. This morning, we have the chance to pick up from where previous environment forums left off. We aim to set the scene and give an opportunity to share with you our draft environmental charter and vision for North Norfolk. So hopefully you can see on the screen an agenda for the day. But before we move on to introductions and opening comments from our Chief Executive, Steve Blatch, and Councillor Nigel Lloyd, our portfolio holder for Environmental Services, Climate Change and the Environment, I just wanted to run through some quick housekeeping. So as you'll probably know and see on your screens, we are recording the session today. This is purely because we had quite a few people who couldn't attend the forum, but who wanted to watch back through it. Can I also please ask that if you are not already muted, that you mute yourselves so that the sound quality is as good as possible for everyone. And we do kindly ask that you keep yourselves muted throughout the forum today. As stated in the invites, we will be using a tool today called Slido, which we will briefly road test in a minute. The idea for this is that it's in preparation for a question and answer session later this morning. You will need a smartphone or a tablet to access Slido. We really hope that you find using this tool simple and that it gives you a chance to interact with us today during the session. If you think of any questions throughout the day, then you can ask them on Slido by using the QR code, which you'll see on your screen in a minute, or the link slido.com, and then you need to enter the code 885292. The questions will then appear on the screen later on in the day when we open up the question and answer session. If the tool Slido isn't for you, which is totally fair enough, then the chat function on Zoom is enabled. And this can be used throughout the session, though we do encourage you to ask questions via Slido if possible. If, however, throughout the morning there are any brief points of clarification or quick queries, then the chat function can be used on Zoom, and either I or my colleague Nigel will try and answer as best we can. At the end of today's session, we were also going to circulate a questionnaire in order to garner feedback from you on both the event and also on the Council's Environmental Charter. And of course, you can also contact the Council's Climate Change and Environment team at any time, and the email address is up here on the screen. So that's environment.forum@north-norfolk.gov.uk. So without further ado, let us start today's forum with some questions on our tool Slido. So I'll talk you all through it for those of you who aren't familiar with the tool. So if you go onto the QR code on your screen or you type slido.com, you can go onto it and answer the first tester question, which is, how are you all feeling today? So I'll join in as well. Okay, we've got some people coming through. And as more people type the same word, then it gets bigger and bigger on our screen. So lots of positive things on the screen. Brilliant. So hopefully, as those come through, we can see we've had 22 people post a comment so far. So we can see that the tool is working. Okay. It's good to see that so many of you are feeling positive today. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to getting out in that sun later on. So I'm going to move on to the next question on Slido, which should automatically come up on your phone or on your tablet. So there we go. This is a bit more of a insightful one. So who are you? You're either an organisation, counsellors we've got already. And there you should see the answers coming up on our screen. So it's interesting to see most people joining us today are from an organisation, charity or community group. 19% of people on the call are a resident of North Norfolk, 16% are counsellors, 16% are none of the above. We've got no one from local businesses, 15% counsellor, still changing, but vast majority of people seem to be from an organisation, charity or community group at nearly 30% of the call. Right, we will move on to the next one. So
Annie,
why
just
you...
before you move on, someone's put in the chat, how do we access the tool again, please? Can you just repeat that?
Yeah, so if you've got a smartphone or a tablet, then you can scan the QR code, which is the big square in the corner of the screen if you've got a QR code scanner. And if you don't have that, then you need to go to www.slido.com. And when you get to that, there'll be a box that says type in the code. And the code is 885292. And when you type that in, there should be a link below it to the North Norfolk District Council's Slido. So that's how you get onto it.
Some people have got more than one person with them, so I guess they can only do, well, if they've each got a mobile phone, they can each do that. But please don't feel left out. This isn't sort of, it's an interesting part of today, but it's not essential, and there are plenty of other opportunities to engage.
Yeah, and the main reason we're using the tool today is for the question and answer session later on. So if people are really struggling with the tool, then you can type a question into the chat box for later. So yeah, don't worry too much if you're not able to access the tool. But again, as you can see today, most people are here today, and it's kind of what I expected, to find out what the council is doing to address climate change. And a good amount of people have joined us to find out about how they can get involved in climate action. So that's brilliant to see. So I am going to move on to the next one. So this one, you should be able to either select two or drag two of your top priorities into the box on your phone screens or your tablet screens. So that's, which two issues do you think that the council should prioritise? And I've given a list of them, and obviously they're not, that's not an exhaustive list. There are other ones in there. So we've got biodiversity loss and clean green energy coming out as the top ones at the moment. and still got biodiversity loss coming in at number 1 with over 24 responses, 27. Okay, so hopefully that was just a little bit of a road testing, as I said, that to use this tool for the question and answer session later on, because there are so many people on the call today, we wanted to be able to try and do it so that people didn't have to put their hands up, and it's a way to try and make the Q&A session as manageable as possible. But as I said, if you are struggling, then please do type things into the chat bar, and we'll try and respond to you that way as well. So I'm now going to move on to the next screen. Okay, so we just sorry, Felix, if you're on the call, are you able to share your screen with the video of Nigel and Steve, because it's not on my PowerPoint?
Yes,
Brilliant.
Just load it up.
Thank you, Felix. So so hopefully that gave you an opportunity to get used to the Slido tool. But for a proper introduction this morning, Felix is going to share with you in a moment a recording of our Chief Executive, Steve Blatch, and our Councillor, Nigel Lloyd, who's the portfolio holder for environmental services, climate change and the environment. So in a moment, Felix will share his screen with you.
And Annie, I've noticed people are already putting some interesting questions in the Slido chat, and perhaps you could remind people that if you don't all have to add a question, you can actually vote up other people's questions by using the thumb, so that all seems to be happening quite nicely.
Oh, that's brilliant. So yeah, so in the Q&A session on Slido, yeah, as Rob says, if you don't specifically want to answer a question or ask a question yourself, you can upvote by clicking the thumb, and that will kind of position the number 1 questions that you want answering up at the top of our screens later on in the session.
But all the questions will be sort of captured for us for later use, and if we need to follow up with answers after the event, then we will do.
Lovely. I just need to start sharing my screen, Annie.
Okay. Do I need to stop sharing mine?
Yes, please. Yeah. Can we all see?
Yep. Brilliant. Thanks, Felix.
Hello. Thank you for your interest in joining this meeting of the North Norfolk Environment Forum, as we seek to move forward with the Council's corporate plan environmental objectives beyond what has been a challenging 12 months due to COVID. We are incredibly unfortunate in North Norfolk to live in a beautiful part of the world, with unique landscapes and natural areas, and yet in a global interconnected ecosystem, the future of our district is fundamentally linked and dependent upon the actions of others as well as ourselves. North Norfolk is in the front line of climate change and global warming through sea level rise, more extreme weather events, coastal erosion, changing water levels in the Broads, and drier summers impact upon our agricultural production and economy. So at a local level, we as a council wish to lead by example, and were the first authority in Norfolk to declare a climate emergency in April 2019. We now wish to work with local partners in converting this declaration into action. The Council has already taken a number of steps towards increasing its commitment to deliver on environmental projects, including the appointment of dedicated staff, and now wishes to take forward our programme more quickly, at pace, through strengthening our engagement with yourselves, residents, businesses and partners through the Environment Forum, and to deliver real change and improvement in the days, months and years ahead. I therefore thank you for your participation in today's Environment Forum workshop and look forward to your continued support and commitment in working with the District Council as we go on this journey together. I hope you have a really productive workshop. Thank you very much for your support.
Hello and welcome to North Norfolk District Council's Environmental Forum. Here in North Norfolk, we are so lucky to have such an amazing natural environment which contributes to the quality of life of our local residents, plays a vital role in supporting the local visitor economy, as well as playing host to a wealth of natural and cultural assets and biological diversity. In April 2019, the Council declared a climate emergency, and we are now committed to a net zero carbon emission target by 2030, placing the natural environment and climate change adaptation and mitigation at the forefront and the centre of our service delivery. Here at North Norfolk District Council, we are not just focused on decarbonising our own estate, but want to help North Norfolk as a whole district to move towards a low carbon, environmentally excellent future. Since 2019, NNDC has launched an ambitious planting project which seeks to enhance the biodiversity across the district by planting 110,000 trees. The Council has placed an emphasis on planting native broadleaf tree species which are vital for supporting habitat for the wide range of important fauna and flora that exists within the district. By project completion, North Norfolk will have an additional 50 to 60 hectares of canopy cover and will have worked with community groups, charities, businesses and individual residents to see this target come to fruition. To date, we have planted around 20,000 trees, have projects in the pipeline for an additional 60,000 and are continuing to look for sites to deliver the remaining sum. Whilst working to support the natural environment is a key component of the Council's work to address the climate emergency, we are also focused on innovative solutions to decarbonise our own estate. We now have a complete picture of our own carbon baseline, which means that we can start to target the areas where our carbon emissions are the most high. For example, since 2019, 90 solar panels were installed on the roof of the Council's main offices. These panels have set the Council off on its journey to decarbonise and have reduced our reliance on fossil fuels. To put this in context, the panels generate enough electricity on an annual basis to power around 52 homes. Since the Council's climate emergency was declared, significant inroads have been achieved to build the new Reef Leisure Centre in Sheringham, which has a much better thermal performance than its predecessor and will further our steps to reducing our carbon footprint. At NNDC, we know that we have an important role to play in supporting our communities to switch to low carbon lifestyles, and also recognise that being a very rural district, many of our residents rely on cars. We are therefore installing charging infrastructure within our market towns as well as at our main office building. We are also in the process of adopting a new local plan which again puts the environment at the heart of the planning system. But we know we have a lot of work to do still, and that the challenges should not be underestimated. Later this morning you will hear from our new climate and environmental team regarding the Council's Environmental Charter, an idea that was spearheaded by the Environmental Forum. So thanks to these forums, we now have developed this important document which will pave our way towards a net carbon emissions future and environmental excellence. Moving forward, we want these forums to continue to be a place for an ongoing, fruitful, thought-provoking and meaningful dialogue with you, with our residents, with our businesses and with our local communities. We look forward to working with you across the coming months and years to address the challenges of the climate change and environmental emergency and to move North Norfolk towards a better, brighter, low-carbon future.
Back to you, Annie.
I should say while the tech bits are going on in the background that Councillor Nigel Lloyd is with us today, but we thought that actually using videos was an easier way of making sure that things would work in a smoother fashion. But IT has other ideas as always. You there, Annie?
Yeah, sorry, I was doing that classic thing of speaking while I was muted. But yeah, thank you to both Steve and to Councillor Lloyd for their comments and reflections on this morning. I am now going to hand over today's next session to Dr. Nick Brooks, who's going to talk to us about what the climate crisis means for us here in North Norfolk. Nick has a background in climate science, a PhD in the events of the Sahel drought in northern Nigeria, Niger and Mali, and has worked on adaptation-related issues since 2001. In 2005, Nick made the move from academia to consultancy and established Garama in 2012. As Garama's director, Nick has worked with a range of clients, including governments, NGOs, research organisations and consultancy firms. So without further ado, over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Annie. Thanks for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here. So as Annie said, I'm Nick Brooks. I run a small firm, Garama 3C, based in Norwich. It offers consultancy and training services around climate change. My background, as Annie indicated, is in climate science and adaptation. And recently I've been doing more work around the growing net zero agenda. I should also say that I was born in West Runton and grew up in Sheringham, so I have a special attachment to North Norfolk, and I'm really, really pleased to be working with colleagues in the council and with the rest of you as well. So I guess the first thing to say, just Annie, am I in control of the slides, or do I need to ask you to move to?
I'll move to the slides for you if you just let me know.
Yeah, I'll let you know. Okay, that's great, thanks. So what I want to do today is to say something about the implications of climate change and the climate crisis for North Norfolk, what this means in terms of how we mitigate climate change, by which we mean reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Mitigation is our sort of technical climate geek speak for reducing our emissions, but also how we adapt to the impacts of climate change. And I want to place this in something of a global context as well. So globally, action on climate change is framed by the Paris Agreement, and this agreement commits the world's governments to limiting warming to no more than 2 degrees Celsius at most, and preferably no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. So collectively, national and sort of corporate net zero commitments are intended to help us achieve these Paris goals of limiting warming below 1.5 to 2 degrees. But we need to acknowledge that despite all the commitments that we're seeing, and lots happening this week, and I'll say a little bit about that too, based on current policies, what governments are actually doing, we're actually heading for a warming somewhere in the region of 3 degrees by the end of the century. If all countries genuinely do deliver on their pledges and targets under the Paris Agreement, we're likely to bring warming below 3 degrees, but still be in excess of the 2-degree threshold. And so there's been a flurry of announcements this week. We've had new commitments from the UK, the US, the EU, and I think other countries as well. But of course, these all sound very ambitious, and they're great to see, but these targets still have to be translated into policies and actions. And it's worth saying that even with the new ambition from the US, that's still not quite compatible with the 1.5 degree Celsius target. So there's a long way to go, and while the intention is there, we're not yet on the pathway that brings us down significantly below 3 degrees. And we really need to step off that pathway. To put this in something of a long-term perspective, a warming of 3 degrees Celsius is at the lower end of the warming that you expect coming out of an ice age into a warm interglacial. And the transition from the peak of the last ice age, around 21,000 years ago, to the warm conditions under which human civilization has flourished, took about 10,000 years. So we're driving really rapid warming, some 50 to 100 times faster than would occur under comparable geological periods of warming. So a world that's 3 degrees warmer would be a very different place. And this amount of warming would mean changes in the availability and distribution worldwide of key resources, principally water, productive and habitable land, in the distribution of species and ecosystems. And of course, it would mean profound changes in local and regional climatic and environmental conditions. And some parts of the world that are currently densely populated would be likely to become effectively uninhabitable. It's not the end of the world, but it is potentially very, very catastrophic for many parts of the world. So to deliver on the Paris commitments, which we really need to try and do, we need massive and immediate reductions in emissions that we then sustain for decades. And so if I could ask Annie to give me the first slide, please. Great. So we can see the magnitude of challenge in these two graphics here. there's quite a lot going on, but there's a simple message really. On the left, we've got what we might call a family of greenhouse gas emissions pathways from the 2018 IPCC report, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that looked at how we achieve this 1.5 degree target or threshold, keep below 1.5 degrees of warming. And on the right, we have a graphic from last year's emissions gap by the UN Environment Programme. This is an annual report that looks at what the gap is between where we need to be and where we are. And so the blue curve that says current policy scenario is basically the trajectory we're on. And these curves that have a steep decline underneath it, labeled 2 degrees, 1.8 and 1.5, are what needs to happen to emissions in order to keep below those temperature thresholds. So, as I said, there's quite a lot going on. It's quite a busy sort of slide here, but there's one very clear message, and that is that if we want to get onto emissions trajectories globally that are compatible with meeting these Paris targets, and we see where the red arrows are, we need a precipitous drop in global emissions starting around 2020. And for those of us who are paying attention, we'll realize that this was last year. So what this is saying is that we need an immediate massive reduction in emissions that is then sustained again for decades. So this shows us something of the magnitude of the challenge that we have. So we've heard a lot about how emissions have declined during the pandemic. So I think it's worth just saying something about that as well. So if I can ask Annie for the next slide, please. Thanks. So this shows us the impacts of the pandemic on emissions globally throughout 2020. So the graphic here shows how emissions dropped, and the biggest decrease, we can see this big sort of trough around about April, May, was in spring, and the largest contribution to that was a drop in the use of surface transport. But we can see that emissions are already creeping back up again, and they rose quite rapidly after spring 2020. So the latest estimate is that global emissions were reduced by around 6.4% over the course of 2020. In the UK, this was higher, it was around 9%, considering all greenhouse gases, and I think 10.7% if we look at just CO2 alone. And again, most of this reduction was, earlier in the year, I think, and associated with reduced surface transport and travel, commuting and so on. So to put this fall in perspective, it's around 1% lower than what's needed every year for many decades to keep below the 1.5 degree threshold, the more stringent Paris target. And as we can see here, emissions are already bouncing back, and in China, they're already above pre-pandemic levels. And a recent report by Vivid Economics, a UK consulting firm, concluded that the stimulus packages of 21 major economies are dominated by what they referred to as potentially damaging contributions based on fossil fuel extraction and combustion. So what it looks like is, notwithstanding the announcements we've heard this week, is the actual trajectory is that we're returning to business as usual and in danger of missing this opportunity to transition to a lower emissions world, a vastly lower emissions world, as we come out of the pandemic. So there are two key takeaways from all of this. I think the first is that we need to take some really bold decisions to keep warming as low as possible, as close to these Paris limits and preferably below them as we can. And this is absolutely critical. But I think we also need to recognise, if we're concerned with the impacts of climate change on our area, for example, that there's a good chance that we will breach these Paris thresholds. So we could breach the 1.5 degree limit around about 2030, or that's probably more likely we'll do this in the 2040s, and the 2 degree threshold sometime around mid-century. We still can't rule out a warming of 3 degrees or more. So while we need to do everything we can to stop warming reaching 3 degrees and keep it as low as possible, we also need to be prudently planning for warming in excess of those Paris thresholds. And we need to be thinking about that now. Of course, down the line, if we see things are looking much, much better and all of the targets are being met, then we might rethink that. But we can't rest on our laurels here. So what does all this mean for the UK and for North Norfolk in particular, in terms of both adaptation and mitigation? What does responding to climate change mean for planning and for the way that we live our lives? And I think, if I can just ask for the next slide, please, Annie. The first thing to say is that on the mitigation side, reducing emissions, the UK has actually been doing pretty well compared to a lot of countries, notwithstanding some of the discussion we had earlier about exporting those emissions to manufacturing countries that are producing the goods that we buy. So On this graph, we've got a left-hand graphic that shows historical emissions, the sort of the solid black curve, and how they've been declining by about 40% since 1990. It's territorial emissions, so not including exported emissions. And the dotted purple line shows where we need to be going to meet the national net zero target. And this is from the Committee on Climate Change, from a report last year titled their 6th annual carbon budget. And this is the thing that the government has adopted this week and committed to a reduction by 2035 of 78% in terms of emissions. So that's great. The government has adopted the recommendations broadly of the Climate Change Committee. So this shows where we need to be. And I think it's worth saying that the relative success that we've had in reducing emissions nationally has been really down to the decarbonisation of the energy sector, transition from coal and then to gas and then to renewables. And in a sense, that's the easy stuff. What we've got left to do is a lot of the harder stuff, the more difficult sectors to decarbonise. So there are some significant challenges ahead. So yeah, this 78% target still needs to be turned into policies and actions. And I think, again, worth pointing out that currently we're not even on track to deliver on the less stringent targets in the earlier carbon budget. So again, while the news this week is really, really welcome, there's a long way to go. So the right-hand graphic shows the distribution of emissions across sectors for the UK as a whole. And here we can see that electricity production now makes up around 10% of annual emissions because of the transition to renewables. So there's still a lot of scope for improvement here, but we've done well there. Currently, the biggest single source of emissions in the UK is surface transport, followed closely by industry and then buildings, with agriculture making up around 10%. So, of course, if we produce similar graphics for the local level, this is going to be quite variable across the country, depending on the characteristics of individual counties and local authority areas. I had a quick scan at some figures, for North Norfolk, so I'll say a little bit about that, but I won't present any data because it was very back of the envelope on my part. And certainly, we expect North Norfolk's rural character to influence the distribution of its emissions. We'd probably expect a greater share from agriculture and surface transport, for example. But actually, what appears to be the case from the data that I had a brief look at just a day or so ago is that we've got a lower share from agriculture. Now, I'm not sure whether that's because certain things are included in other sectors. Surface transport for North Norfolk is a little bit higher than nationally. But what was really striking was it seems that we have a massively greater contribution from buildings to the national average. So that goes some way towards setting our priorities here. And Annie might say more about that afterwards. So let's look at some of these sectors, from a North Norfolk perspective. And let's look first at surface transport. This has already been, I think, pointed out in some of the questions. In North Norfolk, we have a high dependence on private vehicle use and ownership. And this has a bearing on how we decarbonise surface transport. So a shift to electric vehicles is certainly going to be necessary, and I think the council is supporting that. It's also worth pointing out that there are some issues around this transition, not specifically related to North Norfolk, but in general. So for a start, electrifying just the UK's vehicle fleet will take a massive amount of resources. And based on existing technologies, it's been estimated that this will require, for the UK alone, around twice the annual global production of cobalt, all of the annual production of certain other rare earth metals, and more than half the world's annual production of copper, just to decarbonise the UK's, or to make that transition to electrify the UK's vehicle fleet. And of course, globally, this is going to be amplified a lot to address, I think, the 2 billion vehicles in the world. And there are concerns that, in the race for these resources, companies are going to start exploring the deep ocean with potential, large-scale ecological devastation in the oceans. So I think looking at the challenges around transition to EVs, electrification of transport, it illustrates one of the challenges around net zero, and one of the key messages, I think, which is that we can't just achieve our net zero ambitions by doing business as usual, but with renewables. We do need much more fundamental transitions, including behaviour change as well as technological change. And once we start looking at changes in behaviour, of course, we come up against questions of fairness and affordability. For example, can everybody afford to transition to an electric vehicle? What sort of behaviour change can and should we expect in a rural context such as North Norfolk? where public transport is a far cry from the mass transit systems that we have in cities. So there are some real sort of key issues here that we need to tackle with. Can we manage planning processes to reduce the need for car journeys? Can we leverage the recent shift to home working to sustain a reduction in commuting? And what can the council do beyond simply supporting an expansion in EV charging points, which is really necessary? That's absolutely essential, but I think we need to think about other things as well. And I think these are the kind of questions we need to be asking and having, open discussions about, as a county, as a community. So domestic buildings are obviously another very, very challenging area. And again, in North Norfolk, they seem to make a much bigger contribution than they do nationally on average. And the main issue here is the need for a shift away from gas boilers and off-grid coal and oil. Actually, yes, coal and oil-based heating. The house I grew up in Sheringham had heating powered by an anthracite boiler, for example. I'm not quite sure how many of those are still around, but certainly in North Norfolk, a lot of people are not on the gas grid. So even though gas is a fossil fuel that we need to move away from, some people are still using more emissions-intensive fuels. What can the local authority do to encourage this transition to things like heat pumps and potentially even hydrogen-ready gas boilers? So public awareness campaigns are one possible option, but again we come up against these issues of affordability and fairness. For new developments, we might look at working with developers to encourage things like community and district heating systems, which can be very efficient and very low emissions. But again, what about retrofitting older homes? So there are some key questions here about, what can be done locally, given the sort of political and finance constraints as well. So of course, agriculture is also a hugely important sector for North Norfolk, and farm emissions come from livestock, from chemical fertilizers, from farm infrastructure, on-farm transport and energy use, the transport and distribution of farm products, farm waste, and emissions from disturbed soils. So there's a whole host of sources there. And there's a question of how much these emissions can be reduced and what role there is, for example, for on-farm carbon sequestration, maybe in combination with rewilding, to try and offset some of those difficult to mitigate emissions. What role is there, for example, for the production of biofuels, given that these might compete with food production, but that they might also be used in, for example, surface transport? It's also worth mentioning the fact that we have the Bacton gas plant here in North Norfolk as well, our own piece of fossil fuel generating infrastructure, and this also needs to be addressed. And I understand there are plans here to shift to hydrogen production, initially from natural gas and ultimately through electrolysis powered by renewables. And so perhaps there's a potential link here with reducing emissions from domestic power and transport. And I think this illustrates the need for a very sort of holistic, joined up thinking across sectors and keep, trying to avoid thinking in sectoral silos. So let's turn to how we adapt to the impacts of climate change in North Norfolk. And the most obvious risk here, which has already been mentioned, is the risk to the coast. And this results from a combination of sea level rise, accelerated erosion, changes in storm behavior, and associated coastal flood risks. So I've got some maps here which show how climate change is likely to affect flood risk and ultimately the shape of our coastline. So Annie, if you could move to the next one, please, that'd be great. Thank you. So I'll start with this map, which shows areas that are below the highest high tide line experienced over the past 30 years. So these are areas that are currently at risk from flooding under extreme tides. And we see the red areas represent these sort of high flood risk areas under sort of recent historical extremes. So of course we have the Broads, which is very low lying, and then we have the North Norfolk coast. And I think a lot of people here will be familiar with the flooding that occurred in, for example, 2013. I think, again, we had some more recently. So we can see sort of a bit of a preview, if you like, of what might be happening under climate change more frequently if we look at these events. So if we could move to the next slide. Thanks. This shows the same thing, but this is instead of looking at areas within 0 meters of the high tide line, it looks at areas within 1 meter of the high tide line, historical high tide line. So this is how that flood risk progresses if we have a sea level rise of about 1 meter, which we expect by the end of the century. Now, of course, this map doesn't account for changes in coastlines from erosion and so on, or changes in storm activity. So it probably underestimates risk. So again, we don't see a massive increase, but we see a sort of nibbling away at the coast, if you like. So that flood risk area comes further inland, particularly in the North Norfolk coast and the Broads. And the next one, please. And this just shows the same thing with a 2-metre sea level rise, which is possible by 2100, but at the high end of current estimates. So again, Norfolk is pretty much still there, but again, we have a sort of incremental but significant increase in the areas exposed to these coastal flood risks. With the next slide, we are looking a little bit further ahead, and this is the risk map for the high-end estimates of sea level rise by 2200. So we won't be around then, but our descendants will. And the high-end estimates for 2200 are around 7.5 meters. So again, Norfolk is still pretty much there, but we can see quite a big increase in the flood risk. And of course, with a sea level rise of a metre or two, we will also be looking at the permanent inundation of some of these coastal areas. And then I think it's worth recalling that the last time the Earth was 3 degrees warmer, if we do get that far, if we do fail, for example, with all our ambitious mitigation targets, last time it was 3 degrees warmer, sea levels were 20 to 30 meters higher than they are today. So just for fun, I've got another map here, which shows, and we've changed the color because I had to use a different tool, the web tool that I used to do the other maps only went up to 10 meters. So in hundreds and hundreds of years, if we don't mitigate, then we can see a Norfolk that looks something like this, under 20 meters of sea level rise, and then if we go to the next one, under 30 meters of sea level rise. So I guess you could look at this one of two ways, that well, a lot of Norfolk is still there in 1,000 years, even if we perform really badly, or if you're a pessimist, say, well, a lot of Norfolk isn't. So I think this, while this is maybe not something we need to concern ourselves with in our lifetimes, if we look back at our national and local history, we do look back, 1,000 years or more. So if we are, thinking long term, then let's keep this in mind, that, the decisions we make today, collectively, globally, do, alter the face of the planet for thousands of years to come in the future. So lots riding on this for future generations. So this all raises questions about how we respond to these kinds of risks. To what extent can we continue to protect our existing coastlines under these potentially larger amounts of sea level rise? And at what point do we accept that coastal land is just going to be lost? How do we adapt our coastal planning, zoning, and our existing settlements? And I think a key issue along the North Norfolk coast and in the Broads is how we manage coastal ecosystems in the face of sea level rise. So one option is to help them to migrate inland, to help them try and keep pace with sea level rise. And they might not be able to do this very easily naturally, so they might need some assistance. But this in turn raises questions about what happens when we have this phenomenon of coastal squeeze, when ecosystems are squeezed between an expanding or a shoreline that's coming further inland, and between hard infrastructure, roads and settlements and so on the other side. So I always think of things like the Clyde Marshes here, and you've got the road and the town and the village. And what happens there as the sea levels rise and those coastal ecosystems get squeezed and shrink and shrink? Are they going to disappear? We're going to try and help those to recreate themselves inland. And I think these are critical questions, because there will be some trade-offs there. So we need to think very hard about how we manage these risks in the future if we want to preserve our natural heritage. So climate change will also have profound implications for agriculture in North Norfolk. And as elsewhere, high temperatures and reduced summer rainfall will increase the likelihood and the severity of drought during the growing season, at the same time as reductions in soil moisture are going to increase water demand. So an increase in the intensity of summer rainfall, even while we might have drought, we could have heavier rainfall, will increase risks of crop damage, and increased climatic variability and unpredictability is going to mean a greater general risk of disruptive extremes. So these might include protracted wet episodes, such as we saw last autumn, unexpected cold extremes, and extended periods of unusually dry or humid conditions. And these might be associated with changes in the prevalence of pests and diseases. And North Norfolk will also face a more general set of risks and adaptation issues. So more frequent and severe heat extremes have implications for health and for natural systems and potentially infrastructure. Drought and waterlogging, followed by heavy rainfall, will increase the risk of flash flooding And this is likely to be exacerbated by more severe winter storms, which is something we're already seeing in the UK. And then there's also the possibility of what we call climate surprises. And one example is this possibility of the slowdown or shutdown of the North Atlantic circulation, which is associated with the Gulf Stream that keeps us warm in the cooler months of the year. It makes Western Europe a lot warmer than equivalent latitudes in North America, for example. So about 20 years ago, people were quite concerned about the potential shutdown or severe slowdown of the North Atlantic circulation. And then they stopped worrying about it so much because the models weren't really predicting it and so on. But we've seen some observational evidence recently that this slowdown is occurring. So some people are becoming quite concerned about this again. And if we do see a significant slowdown in the circulation, we could experience much more severe winters, greater cooling. It could offset quite a bit of the regional warming. So colder conditions outside the summer months, certainly. And again, with implications for things like transport, infrastructure and agriculture. At the moment, I think we're expecting things to get generally warmer, the growing seasons to be extended, but this could reverse all that. And we've had some sort of pretty cold snap sort of late into this spring, and that sort of thing could become much more common. And so more generally, of course, we're also exposed, as is everybody, to the secondary impacts of climate change and climate-related disasters occurring in other parts of the world. So I think increasingly these are going to pose like a risk to supply chains, commodity prices, and political stability. So what are the knock-on effects for us here? And I think to survive in a world that's increasingly beset by climatic disruption, we need to really focus on building resilience at both the national and the local level. And so this means getting the balance right between, for example, self-reliance and reliance on global networks. It's one thing to say, well, we're going to be self-reliant, so we're not affected so much by these things that happen in other parts of the world. But what if we get hit ourselves directly by, the impacts of climate change here? We need to be able to call on assistance from elsewhere. So I think isolationism and pure self-sufficiency isn't the answer. We need some sort of flexibility. So we can rely on local resources and production when we need to, but call on national and international networks and partnerships when we suffer those impacts ourselves. And so I think the other thing we need to do is move away from a reliance on vulnerable supply chains based on the idea of just enough, just in time, because these tend to prioritize economic efficiency, understandably, to reduce costs above everything else, but they do make systems very, very vulnerable to shocks. And we need more resilience in our systems, and that means more redundancy, which is often in tension and a trade-off when it comes to that compared to economic efficiency. So I think there's a lot for local government to contend with, and local authorities need to engage seriously now with decarbonisation and adaptation challenges. And the actions of local government, I think, certainly need to go beyond the decarbonisation of council activities and infrastructure and help support these wider societal transitions. So local authorities need to engage with the wider community, which is what we're doing here. So this isn't a criticism, this is just a further encouragement, really. And that means engaging with business, industry and the public to drive the necessary transitions to deliver low carbon resilient societies now. And so, of course, we have to recognise that local authorities only have limited spending and legal powers. So they have to be smart and innovative about how they do this. The most obvious response is to align local plans and policies with national policies that are aimed at delivering net zero and building resilience. But I think local actions do need to go further, A, because national policies might not be adequate, and B, because local areas face their own contextual challenges determined by their sort of local characteristics. So I think one of the key things local authorities need to do is engage constructively with stakeholders to try and promote positive behavioural change and combine this with technological change. And I've got one more slide to show, Annie, please. Thank you. And this is a slide from the Committee on Climate Change report from last year. And it shows the breakdown of net zero actions in terms of those that focus on technical measures alone, which is the, I think, the blue wedge. Those that are principally behavioural in nature, the orange wedge. And those that involve a mix of technology and behavioural change, which is I think the pink stuff. If I can read the slide, yes. Yeah. So what we can see here is that, over 50% of the emissions reductions we want to achieve will involve some form of behavioural change. So again, this is back to the message that it's not just about technology. It's not just business as usual with renewables. So we're not talking about sort of individual carbon footprints alone. We're not just talking about recycling and switching to low energy light bulbs, although that sounds terribly old fashioned now. We have to recognize that behavior change isn't just about individual consumers, but it's about everybody in society, including decision makers in government, business and industry. And it's about how changes in behavior in one group may influence changes in another group. So there's quite a lot of complexity here. And this isn't trying to push the responsibility just onto individuals. So a lot of work has highlighted that people tend to act on issues like climate change and the environment when they perceive that there's a risk to something they value and they believe that they have the power to reduce or remove that risk. So it's all very well making people aware of the risks, but they have to have some agency. So we have to try and build that as well, give them the power to do something about it. Otherwise, we're just depressing people. One of the things that they can do is demand action from decision makers. And so this is one aspect of addressing the challenge, greater sort of participation, democracy, if you like, that allows the population of a region to have a greater say in what goes on and put pressure on people who are making decisions that affect the way things are developing. So helping to shift the perceptions of the public around climate change is critical to changing behaviour, but also not just their own behaviour in business and government at all levels, to send the message that people are ready for change and that they even are demanding it. So one thing authorities like NNDC can do is work with researchers and social scientists to identify the factors that, that drive change, the barriers and enabling factors around behavioural change. And of course, another thing we need is vision. And I'm not speaking about this particular context, but just globally, I think we can say that vision and imagination have been sadly lacking in the politics of climate change. It's been very, very sort of unimaginative, I think, in terms of envisaging possible futures. And so we can use scenarios or approaches like scenario planning, not only to identify and address risks from climate change, but also to develop visions of what sort of future we want given the climate change context, and then look at how we can get there. We actually have a lot of expertise in Norfolk in these areas, at places like UEA, the Tyndall Centre, where I worked many, many years ago. And I think building and strengthening partnerships with these organisations, with researchers and so on, to drive the transitions we need is going to be critical. So I think just to conclude, I'm going to say that North Norfolk may be on the front line of climate change and it faces a lot of challenges. But in many respects, I think we're really well placed to confront the crisis, and that's the task that we need to set ourselves. So I'll stop there, and hopefully I didn't take too long to ramble on. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Nick, for your presentation and for your insights. And I'm sure you've provided lots of food for thought for everyone. Nick has really kindly agreed to stick around later for our question and answer session. So if anyone's got any questions that they feel they would like to put to Nick, then please do add those on Slido or put them in the chat bar if you're having Slido issues. So we're now going to move on to present to you today the Council's draft Environmental Charter. And again, of course, there will be an opportunity at the question and answer session to ask questions about the Environmental Charter. We've also said that we'll send round a questionnaire after the session today to all of the delegates of the forum so that you can respond to the Charter as well in your own time. As many of you will know, the concept of the Charter was originally born out of discussions at the Environment Forum, which in turn resulted from North Norfolk District Council's declaration of a climate emergency back in April 2019. But before we really delve into the details of the Charter, I thought I'd briefly reflect on this definition of a climate change emergency, which has been provided by IRUP in a document called "So You've Declared a Climate Emergency, So What Next?" I found this to be a really useful working definition, and it states, there is no fixed definition of a climate emergency, but all declarations made of one made by local and national authorities focus on the need for urgent action to reduce or halt climate change in order to prevent further environmental damage. And I particularly like this definition and find it, well, have found it very useful. And I believe that the Environmental Charter that we've developed fits the brief of this emergency because it too states the broad actions that will underpin the Council's ambitions to reduce and halt climate change. So as a newcomer to North Norfolk, the Council's climate emergency resolution, when I had the opportunity to look through it, it really spoke to me about three main themes, which can be broken down into deliverables. So that first real main theme to me is about net zero carbon emissions, and we have a target of 2030. So what this means is that the carbon emissions that the council's estates and operations generate will be balanced by the amount of emissions that we remove from the atmosphere through various interventions like planting or mitigation strategies such as solar panels, which would generate clean green energy. So effectively as a council, we will reach a net zero carbon emission position when the amount of carbon that we create or that we generate through our activities is no more than the amount of carbon that is taken away or mitigated. And so for the sake of today's conversations, when we talk about estates and operations, those things should be considered as the areas that fall within the council's financial and operational control. So that's really, for me, the first theme of the council's climate emergency. But then moving on from that, the second theme it is around the need for environmental route mapping and the route to environmental sustainability. And again, the charter clearly fits into this key step. And then thirdly, or the point in the middle there is around citizen engagement and increasing carbon literacy. And obviously Nick has picked up on this point, which is around working with our communities to improve understanding of the climate emergency and the ecological crisis, and encouraging others to make proactive changes in their lives to reduce their impacts on the environment. And so that's very much about how we all come together to face this crisis as a whole. And hopefully, as you'll see later on this morning when we look through the charter, you will see that it's picked up on these three main themes which are referenced in the Council's original declaration of a climate change emergency back in 2019. So what is an environmental charter and what exactly is it going to do? Well, the aims of the charter are, or any charter, are to really publicly declare what the organisation's ambitions are. So our charter speaks about the council's ambitions regarding the actions that it's going to take to address the climate emergency. A charter really is a broad set of aims, ambitions and principles. And so our charter looks at what the council will do, but what it doesn't yet do is go into that detail of how it is going to do it. And that detail, of course, will follow. The environmental charter can't say everything that the council is going to do, but what hopefully should come across today is that it references the principles that we will really strive to uphold as an organisation who genuinely take action on climate change seriously. As I previously stated, the charter is obviously a very public-facing document, and it will be on our website, and hopefully it will be used as a tool in which to communicate with our residents, with schools, with community groups, with businesses across the district. And I suppose one of the most important points is that it is a powerful tool for others, because what it does is it holds us, the council, into account. And in that respect, it can be used by others to make sure that we are driving real and meaningful change over time. So the draft charter, which will be shown to you shortly, has been written to reference three themes, or as shown as the infographic on your screen, three main pillars, which have emerged from the council's climate emergency. So within the charter, the three themes that we look at are the first one, which is the steps that we are going to take across our own estates and operations to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2030. The second pillar, or the second theme, is the action planning and route mapping that we will deliver as community leaders. So how we're going to work across the whole district to meet the challenges of the climate emergency. So I think, again, that references some of the things that Nick spoke about today. So it's not just about us looking simply at our own estates and operations, not just us looking at our own emissions, but looking beyond that throughout the district. And then lastly, again, some of the points that Nick mentioned is around behaviour change and around us all in it together, So the last step of the charter looks at how we're going to promote citizen engagement by encouraging others to support us and join us on our journey to deal with the climate emergency. So what we're going to do now is move on to actually look at the charter itself and the pledges that Norfolk District Council are proposing to make. So the first set of pledges that I'm going to show you are around the steps that we are going to be taking across our own estates and operations. So the first couple of pledges that we are making are around measuring our carbon emission baseline data. So this is a piece of work that is now complete, and we will soon be in a position to publish it in the form of a report so that our residents and communities can understand what we will need to do over the coming years to decarbonise our own estates and operations. To help with understanding and to enable you and others to track our progress, we will publish on an annual basis the advancements that we will have made to reduce our carbon emissions. And we will do this until we reach a net zero carbon emission position, which obviously we are setting a 2030 target for. So we know that in order to reach a net zero emissions position by 2030, we will need to reduce the carbon footprint of all of our operational buildings. This process, which Councillor Nigel Lloyd mentioned earlier on, has started at our headquarter building in Cromer with the installation of 90 photovoltaic panels. However, we know that there are really significant steps that we still need to take to reduce our usage of fossil fuels. In order to do this, we will need to be innovative. We will need to tap into emerging technologies, and we will need to invest in systems like air source and ground source heat pumps, for example. As awareness of the climate change emergency is embedded into the decision-making process within the council, we pledge to consider which contractors and external services we use. So we are aware of our supply chain, and we want to make sure that the external companies and organisations that we work with are also making steps to reduce their own carbon emissions. And again, as Nick picked up on, we know that on-road emissions are a major issue, broadly speaking, for the whole of North Norfolk. We are in the process of developing a council transport scheme, which will significantly reduce staff usage of private vehicles by offering greener and more sustainable alternatives. And of course, for us, becoming a single-use plastic-free council by 2023 is an important pledge. As a coastal district, we're acutely aware of the impacts of plastics on the health and vitality of our seas and oceans. And we know across the board that plastic waste has obviously got a hugely adverse impact on the natural environment, and we want to take a stance to prevent these effects from worsening. And lastly, on that first set of themes within the Charter, we want to make sure that across our own council staff, understanding of ecological and climate change crisis is at the forefront of our thinking and our actions. So at the moment, we're working really hard to communicate and engage with our hundreds of staff and councillors working across North Norfolk District Council area to make sure that environmental issues are considered in all of the work that we deliver. We believe, obviously, that the climate change emergency is a cross-cutting theme, and it doesn't just impact one service area within the council. And therefore, we believe that to have a truly lasting and positive change on our environment, we have to act as a whole corporate body to engender real and meaningful change. So I'm now going to pass on to the Assistant Director for Sustainable Growth, Rob Young, who's going to talk you through the next series of pledges that we will be making. So Rob, over to you.
Thanks, Annie. Hopefully you can hear me. Okay, as well as those direct actions, the Council intends to enable others to play their part. The Council pledges, therefore, to invest in a range of measures to support green growth in our local communities. This is currently being put into action through existing projects such as the tree planting scheme, but also through investing in local communities through our Sustainable Communities Fund. Sustainable communities will be the backbone of a better quality of life for all. And so we hope that to promote grassroots projects such as community composting schemes, local energy conservation initiatives, green energy generation programs, community litter picking projects, and rewilding schemes. We'll also invest in community transport initiatives which link people to the services they need without the need to own a car. and to support better provision of and the decarbonisation of public transport. Next slide, please, Annie. As well as a community leader, we aim to support transformative and innovative projects that address the environmental challenges. Active travel, getting where you need to go whilst improving your own health and not adversely impacting on the well-being of others, is now frequently being discussed. We want to work with partners to ensure that walking and cycling infrastructure is improved and promoted, such as the proposals currently being developed for North Walsham Town Centre, for example. A shift in behaviour towards active travel choices will have a positive environmental impact, improve community sustainability, and support healthy, active lifestyles. And that's the kind of win-win we need to strive for. We'll also seek funding and investment by making sure that we have the evidence to justify the development of projects that align to the green industrial revolution. We will work in partnership with a wide range of organisations to make sure we can get the best environmental outcomes for North Norfolk, but ones that also support the local economy. We will seek to support shifts towards green energy and green jobs within the district. We're currently co-funding with New Anglia Local Enterprise Partnership and other partners a study to explore the feasibility of the future transformation of Bacton Gas Terminal for hydrogen production and distribution. Such initiatives will not only be locally important, but nationally significant, and will put North Norfolk at the leading edge of environmental green energy technologies. Next slide, please, Annie. And lastly, we hope to use our position as a community leader to inspire businesses to make changes that support greener outcomes and help them to access emerging low carbon sectors. This may be providing advice, establishing networks, or by showcasing local businesses, large or small, that are leading the way, perhaps using events such as the Council's annual Green Build event. By facilitating a public engagement programme, we will seek to inspire those whose ideas can make a real difference and leave a legacy for future generations. We aim to demonstrate best practice and to stimulate its application in North Norfolk to encourage more sustainable ways of living that will not only benefit our environment, but local communities and the economy on which they depend. And now I'm going to transfer over to Nigel, who's going to do the final theme. Thank you, Annie.
Thank you, Rob. Morning, everyone. Love to see so many of you here this morning. So the pillar of the Charter is really about engaging with residents and communities across the district. We'll encourage and provide opportunities for them to support the climate and ecological emergency in their own individual way. So this pillar is really key for me, as I feel communities and residents have the ability to assert a powerful grassroots influence and impact across a wide range of environmental issues. And it's going to take all of us, not just the council, to make the difficult decisions if we're going to make a big enough difference and limit global warming, ideally to less than 1.5 degrees C. So we want to encourage you, our residents and our communities, to take part in and support environmental events such as this forum and the big tree giveaways that we ran in December. We want you to get involved in environmental campaigns and activities in your local area and support local businesses that are making positive environmental changes, or simply, just give a nudge to those that might need a bit more support to do so. Next slide, please, Annie. So sharing information has never been so easy in the age of social media. So we'll encourage residents to share news about the environmental events, activities and campaigns that they've seen on the Nextdoor app, for example, or about the litter pick that they are doing next week down their road. We want residents to share that article about how protecting whales off our coastline will help tackle climate change on their family WhatsApp group, or by telling their neighbour about a particularly good online carbon footprint calculator and challenging them to see who can reduce their carbon footprint the most. The more people share this kind of information and knowledge, the better understanding we will have of the issues and the solutions, and we'll be better armed to make informed choices that will help reduce the impact of the emergency that we're in. It will also have the added benefit of improving people's well-being, as actively doing something positive in the face of emergency is a powerful stance to take and may help alleviate many people's anxieties about what to do. I know this job really helps me. Next slide, please, Annie. So lastly, we'd like residents, communities and businesses to sign up and pledge to make positive actions to reduce the impact of the climate and ecological emergency. So we're in the middle of creating a climate and ecological emergency webpage on our website, and we're hoping to have a pledge wall that residents can write their pledges on. For now, their pledge could just be a note on the fridge door reminding them to leave meat off the menu on Mondays, or to switch their energy tariff to 100% renewable one by the end of the week. But whatever people decide to do, we sort of want to go back to the sharing element of this charter and ask that people don't just keep it to themselves, as their pledge could be the spark that encourages others to take action. The final point on the charter is that we ask residents and communities to sign up to our and other environmental organizations, many of which are in this event. Sign up to their newsletters, social media, and just find out about the latest news, events and actions that residents can do to help address the climate and ecological emergency. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nigel and Rob. So we're now going to move on to our live Q&A session, which I'm going to hand over in the very capable hands of Rob to manage. There are a couple of people, I've got names on the screen of who will be answering questions, but I think there might be a couple of council officers as well lurking in the audience as well who might be able to help us out. I'm going to pass over to Rob and I'm going to click on to Slido. And we've already got some questions up there. So Rob, over to you.
Yeah, hopefully those of you who are using Slido have been looking at the questions as they come through, and I see quite a few of them have been voted up. Some are specifically for Nick, which he has generously offered to respond to. So thank you for that. I think probably that there probably are too many to deal within the time available, but maybe not. But if we attempt to go through them in the order, the sort of priority order of those that are most popular. And we do have a number of other council officers and probably other people from other walks of life who may be best placed to answer some of these questions. So shall we pick up on this one, which is very much for the council. So the new local plan, I don't know whether everybody's familiar with the term local plan, but it's the planning policy framework which sets out where development can and can't take place, and the factors that are taken into account in planning decisions. So how will that local plan reflect the council's environmental ambitions? Is there joined up thinking between planning and the climate teams? And actually this question came up at council meeting on Wednesday of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. So we do have, I think, somebody from the planning policy team, but I'll kick off by saying the council has recently restructured, and what it's done is brought, well, not only have we created this new team that Annie's heading up, we've brought that together with other services such as affordable housing delivery, economic growth, and also coastal management. So we're looking at various different sort of outward facing services joining together under that sort of sustainable growth agenda. That team is in the same directorate as the planning team and the planning policy team. So in terms of working relationships within the council, we've made the changes that will enable that to happen. But whether the local plan includes sufficient policies and proposals to address the environmental ambitions is perhaps one for one of the planning teams to pick up, or in fact Nigel Lloyd, Councillor Nigel Lloyd, if he wants to deal with that, because I think that our new local plan, which is at the sort of draft stage, is significantly different from its predecessors. So there is very much an environmental and sustainability theme within that. So have I got any offers of anybody else, any of the other participants from the council who wish to address the details of that?
If you would like.
Yeah, thanks, Ian.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ian Whittington. I'm the planning policy team leader. What I would say on the local plan is that in the forthcoming version, which will be coming out around about the summertime, there is going to be significant emphasis placed within the document itself on climate change and how through the local plan it can set a framework for others, and it really is this joint approach that can prioritize and step up to this challenge. It's not just a significant emphasis placed by the local council, but it's also coming through national policy. And what essentially the local plan does is to set this framework to achieve a sustainable development. And in doing so, it's very much raised the profile, or it's aiming to raise the profile of policies on climate change around land use planning, mitigation, and adaptation. We've heard a lot this morning that the council's pledging to do an awful lot on outside the planning arena, but you do have to, it's such a broad subject. You have to remember that the policies themselves will affect future growth. And this Environment Charter today is pledging that the council will work with the community to set wider parameters of that and involve people on it, whereas the local plan will also do that by setting this framework and getting those that are seeking to develop new development to consider all the aspects of climate change right up at the beginning of their development proposals. And I say that the whole plan has got sections on the facilitation of renewable and low carbon energy. It's setting targets for sustainable construction and carbon reduction in new developments, and they're progressive targets aligned with government ambitions for reduction in carbon through building regulations. We're seeking higher standards in water efficiency in development and residential usage. We have policies around the coastal management areas, which restrict development in certain areas at risk of coastal erosion, but also help facilitate and adapt to communities at risk from coastal erosion. So we're facilitating redevelopment in areas where we wouldn't normally allow it. The whole ethos, if you like, of the distribution of growth is looking at concentrating that growth where there's services and facilities. And one of the justifications is to reduce the level of travel, which we've heard already that one of the highest or the highest contribution to carbon in the district is actual public transport, private car use, public transport. So it's collectively looking at all this. The plan is also looking at setting out requirements for electric charging framework, infrastructure in buildings, in car parks, and the requirement to be included within buildings. And all of this is looking at almost 100 years ahead in terms of flood risk. We have detailed evidence on climate change flood extents, which we take into account. And are directing all future growth to ensure that they use these climate change projections in flood extents in order to develop and adapt to their development. There's an awful lot more in the plan, including biodiversity net gains, green infrastructure, tree planting and design. It's one of the most greenest plans that I've worked on, and it really is emphasizing the combined approach, if you like, is looking at the environment and behavioral change, but it can't do it alone. It has to set a framework and allow others to develop to it. So this charter is part of it. It's part of educating developers and people of North Norfolk to enable that all this is taken into the forefront and is a consideration in planning going forward.
Thanks, Ian. So there's a pretty comprehensive demonstration that these matters have been taken into consideration in the local plan. We've got the cabinet member for planning in at the event as well today. I don't know whether Councillor John Toy, whether you want to make any comments in relation to that, or if you've got, or you or any others want to add anything to what Ian's just said.
I know clearly. I mean, as
Thanks,
I've spoken recently. I don't know if you can see me this morning.
Can't see your picture, but we can hear you well. Thanks.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. No. So no, we continue to work on this. With Ian and the team to every time there's an opportunity arises, we look. When there's something announced by government, we look to see where we can take that and better it and improve it. We look to find the maximum that we can get out of everything, every opportunity. So, but as Ian says as well, it needs to be joined up with all other departments and with this forum. Hence why we're here today, to be engaged with it, so we can get this collective thinking towards it. And I think there's some encouraging work going on in the council to try and, like this, we refer to people. Part of developing the plan has been listening to what people have had to say, to include that. So hopefully, going forward, we're going to deliver some real changes for the people of North Norfolk and, of course, the wider Weldon community that we live in.
Thanks, John. And actually, you can all play your part. Anybody within North Norfolk or beyond can react to the proposals that are in the plan. They can help to inform the way it's taken forward, and you can make sure that it is used in decisions that affect your localities. So I will then move on to Ned's question, which is an interesting one. So an example from East Sussex Council, where they've pledged to plant about 100 areas, 100 areas of land for conservation and rewilding. So would this council consider similar schemes? I think I'll kick off with Annie, who's got a background in such things and has mentioned rewilding to me more times than I can remember. So Annie, and then maybe there will be someone else who wants to make a further contribution.
Great, thanks, Rob. Yeah, so I think we've had some initial discussions with the team at North in the council who manage our green spaces. So things like, we call them amenity sites. So kind of our what we would traditionally consider to be mown grass areas, and we're talking about rewilding those, and that is an ongoing discussion, and we haven't yet finalized the details of that, but that is something that we're looking to do, so to encourage wildflower areas. As a council, we don't actually own a huge amount of land, so it would very much be about having discussions with partner organisations around rewilding. So one of the things that we're looking to do with our tree planting project is looking around natural regeneration as a way of reaching our target. So natural regeneration is a great way to deliver new woodland areas and new wood in a way that is good for biodiversity and is very sustainable. So in that sense, we are kind of looking at rewilding, we're looking at natural regeneration, and we are looking at our own land. But I suppose part of our work as a community leader will be over the coming years, we'll be working with partner organisations and working with other groups to see how we can influence them as well to join us in those pledges. Yeah, I don't know, Nigel, if you've got anything to add to that at all, because you've been involved in some of those discussions.
Yeah, I'd just say we have had discussions with some community groups as well, such as the Cromer Green Space Group, and with Wild East, who Laura's on the call somewhere. So yeah, so we are thinking about this very much so, I think, and yeah, it's really exciting, I think. So yeah.
So I've noticed in the chat, the Zoom chat, Jennifer Tebecki has added another comment, but will rewilded areas be the first to be reversed when we see food shortages in the future? Well, that's yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? And maybe that's a question for the local plan, actually. Can you zone areas as rewilded and hands off? That, I'll leave that one hanging. I don't know the answer to that. It's difficult sometimes to zone areas which are
say
Oh,
something?
go on, Ian. Yeah.
I won't address that point exactly, but I would say that the local plan we're working on finalising a policy that's looking at biodiversity net gain requirement through development. So there would actually be a measurable net gain in biodiversity through development. So if it was, for example, a greenfield site, it was grass, even though it has a proposal for 10 houses, there would be a requirement to ensure that the end result has net beneficial biodiversity. And we're looking at that policy, and that would enhance a lot of open space opportunities as well. Rewilding's part of it, tree planting's part of it. But there you go.
Yeah. No, thanks, Ian. And actually, that will have the force of law behind it, and you know, those areas will be safeguarded through legal agreements and the like. So yeah, can't be given up lightly. But yeah. Somebody's also added, I think Ned has added, can management of roadside areas contribute to rewilding? And I think there's a resounding yes. That's possibly a rhetorical question. And I note that Norfolk County Council have put some messages out around that, who are the highway authorities. They manage roadside verges, and I think they've pledged to reduce their sort of mowing regime for those areas. So unless there's anybody else from the council who's got a sort of burning issue to add in relation to that, I think we will move on to the next question.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go on, Annie. Yep.
Yeah, can I just add to that? I think that also in terms of the rewilding and biodiversity, you know, as a kind of overall subject, I think that part of the work that we're doing is, and we're already starting to have a conversation with some of the really major landowners in North Norfolk about how they manage their land and how we can work with them to support that. And also speaking to farming groups and farmers as well around that practice and how we can be involved in that discussion. And you know, I've worked at, in previous councils, and I think that actually opening up a dialogue with the farming community is quite I mean, it seems like an obvious thing to do, but it is quite innovative, and you know, we've had some really interesting conversations and are getting a much better understanding as well about what the Environment Bill will bring in later this year, and how that's going to impact on land management. So obviously, you know, we anticipate the biodiversity net gain is going to become mandatory, but we also expect there to be other things in that bill that impact on how land is used, and that will then shape North Norfolk as well. So, you know, we expect there to be things around carbon capture and woodland creation. So we're kind of trying to start having those conversations with landowners as soon as possible, and making those connections so that as and when the Environment Bill is adopted, we're in a really strong position to work with landowners as a partner, as opposed to just standing on the sideline and kind of commenting or criticizing. So I just wanted to add that.
Yep, thanks, Annie. And in fact, the next question relates to the roadside verges bit that was put in the Zoom chat. So I don't know whether we've answered that, but there's certainly, this is one of those sort of win-win scenarios, isn't it? That you can save money by reducing your mowing regime whilst improving biodiversity and all that goes with that, and making a more natural and beautiful natural environment. So will NNDC work with landowners to improve biodiversity on highways? Absolutely, we will. We have a close relationship with Norfolk County Council. We will work with them to make sure that that's applied in our area as well as others. And Annie and Nige have only been in post for just about 4 months, but they've already started, as Annie's just said, some really interesting dialogues with a wide range of landowners.
Can I just jump in there, Rob, as well? I think we've got some colleagues from Norfolk County Council on the call today, and I think that also part of the work that we will be doing is to look at all types of green corridors, so not just our highways verges, but also things like hedgerows, woodlands, green spaces in the landscape that connect. And I know that that Norfolk County Council have done some mapping work to try and better understand ecological corridors within the landscape. So I suppose that part of our role at North Norfolk District Council is just ensuring that we're having that dialogue with Norfolk County Council on the work that they're doing, and supporting them. So it's not just around our highways verges, which are obviously important, green corridors, but there's also ongoing discussions about other ecological networks that are really vital and play a really important role in North Norfolk.
And so, yeah, so thanks, Annie. I guess that's what we're doing, but, you know, what are you doing? And our local parish councils and other community organisations who might manage their own areas of land, it could be playing fields or areas around village halls, you know, those can also be rewilded or changed to become more natural in a similar fashion. So those kind of margins of actively managed sites can certainly be looked at in the same way. I'll move on then to the next question. Chemical-based agriculture, so it's kind of linked, but it's a major driver for climate change. Obviously, it's a key part of our local economy as well, not only growing, but the sort of agricultural industry sectors that are built up around that. We must encourage a shift towards sustainable mixed farming. Can NNDC contribute to this change? Annie, do you want to open it up? And I'm not sure whether there's anybody else on the call who has any expertise in this. You may know better than I.
Yeah, well, that's a difficult question. If I'm honest, it's not an area that I know a huge amount in terms of how we would enforce a shift. Again, I think that the role that we have to play as a council is about trying to build relationships with the farming community. You know, it's about trying to make sure that we are working with them as opposed to telling them what to do, because ultimately, you know, they have got vast amounts of experience of working in the landscape, and we kind of need to go on that. It sounds a bit cheesy, but we need to go on that journey with them as opposed to sort of being the enforcers. Again, I don't know if there are details in the local plan specifically that reference chemical-based agriculture. I suspect not. I suspect it sits outside of the scope of it. Ian's shaking his head, which implies that it does. But yeah, again, that is about how we work as a community leader with those sectors to try and encourage those changes. It's also about being tapped in to what's going on at central government level as well, and about making sure that we have a good understanding of existing legislation, so that we are kind of as aware as possible of changes, so that when they happen, we can start those conversations early on. I don't know, Rob, if there's anything else you want to add to that.
No, I mean, as a council, we're a facilitator and an enabler, or we try to be, and an influencer wherever we can. There have been some interesting points in the Zoom chat as we've been talking, and one about soil erosion being a major problem due to artificial fertilizers. And I don't want to put you on the spot, Jake, but I don't know whether you've made a comment in the chat about rewilding. I wonder if you might be well placed to make a comment about sustainable mixed farming. If not, please give me the appropriate gesture in the chat.
So rewilding is great, and there's some wonderful examples in Norfolk of it taking place. But I think sustainable agriculture and still producing food for a global population of 9 billion by 2030 is probably a more sustainable aspiration. I think if I look at North Norfolk specifically, and the sort of nature coastal strip, which is hugely important both nationally and probably internationally, I think it's to try to relocate these areas for an impending sea level rise, which see most of these diverse areas disappear, is probably the greatest challenge. And actually, just to leave areas, the mindset change for many. And if I was very close to the initial rewilding project in Sussex, and it hits a lot of resistance because in the transition period, Nep Castle is 20 years old, and in the transition period, it was unsightly to many. The dreaded rag work was the bane of their life for many years. And I think we can be, seeing and learning from others. I think we have a real opportunity to actually have nature, have biodiversity rich across the district. With looking at some of this regenerative agriculture, restorative, maintaining our soils, carbon sequestration. They're slightly concerned about the reduction of meat. If I look at the importance of Norfolk is blessed with significant areas of wet grassland, which is managed by bovines, and without them the biodiversity disappears. So we must recognise that balance, and actually it's choosing the right meat as opposed to pasture-fed meat is going to be far more sustainable than high-intensity cattle reared. So I think we mustn't shoehorn everything into rewilding, because it's one option in a suite of options that are available to us. And I think geographically, Norfolk is what it has existing and trying to protect and preserve and also adapt for climate change and species migration is probably the key.
Thanks, Jake. Sorry, I should have introduced you, but Jake Fine. Many of you will know Jake either personally or by reputation, I guess, but of Holcombe Estate. So, a major landowner and innovative sort of actor in this field. Yeah, it's about balance, isn't it? We can't have massive shifts from one thing to another, because then there are consequences of that. So moving on to the next question then, how will the council support local businesses wanting to improve their carbon and environmental footprints? Okay, well, we can do lots of things to support local businesses and encourage what they do, and to promote sustainable business practices, for example. And we have, for a number of years, we've had a business awards scheme, and there's been an environmental category of that. Last year it wasn't run because of the interruptions from the pandemic, but we certainly would intend to promote similar sorts of schemes in the future. But the economic growth team, as I've said previously, is part of the sustainable growth team now. So we are looking at economic development in a very different way, and we are willing to hold out to work with all sorts of businesses to help them to access maybe new markets, or to begin to do things differently. And if we can shine a light on what they're doing and sort of hold that up as best practice, we'd be very happy to do so. So moving to the next question, I think, Annie, we may need to keep one eye on the time, but I think we can probably get through a couple more questions. Would the council support the production of green hydrogen from the excess renewable electricity coming onshore at Bacton? The feasibility study which is taking place in relation to Bacton and its potential for hydrogen and carbon capture and storage, for that matter, is going to be extremely interesting. I think there is a recognition from national governments and downwards that that hydrogen has massive potential, but certainly what's referred to as green hydrogen, which uses renewable electricity, is far more environmentally beneficial and far less environmentally destructive, and there is certainly potential for the production of blue hydrogen from that site, which is produced from natural gas. But it's absolutely right that the renewable electricity coming onshore provides a huge opportunity to kind of reconsider the future role of that plant. So I would say absolutely there is potential for green hydrogen, what's referred to as green hydrogen, from Bacton and sites elsewhere. And the study which is currently being undertaken looks at energy usage in the region, but it looks at emissions data as well, and looks at the potential for the uptake of hydrogen. So it's looking at sort of both sides, the economic drivers as well as the opportunities that exist. But we do have that sort of happy coincidence of the offshore renewable energy coming on onshore at that sort of location. Don't note anybody who's got a specific comment about that, so I will move on to the next question. Rather than rush into tree planting, will other options be delivered, such as hedgerow reintroduction, grassland, wildflowers, etc.? So I'll pass to you in the first instance. Annie, was that you just about to speak? Yep. Can't see your picture, sorry.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's a good question. So obviously we've got our 110,000 tree planting ambition, which is a great project in so much as it's increasing and will increase canopy cover across North Norfolk. But I think the point there is a really important one, that actually woodland isn't the only important habitat in North Norfolk. There are lots of other habitats that make this area unique. So obviously in the question there, we've got hedgerows and grassland, but also there are really important habitats in Norfolk that are unique to our area. So salt marshes, we've got heathland as well. I think you know, we're not at a point yet where we've specifically identified what those projects will look like, but one of the pledges is around improving biodiversity across the district, and that doesn't stop at our 110,000 tree project. So, you know, as that project draws towards a close, you know, we will look to work with partner organisations and deliver other projects that support other really important habitats in North Norfolk. I just, as a kind of point of clarification, I suppose, that we would consider hedgerows as part of our tree planting, because we understand that you know, hedgerows are massively important habitat. They're really great at connecting up green space within the landscape, and in many ways interconnected diverse hedgerows are better habitat than individual trees that are planted in isolation from one another. So yeah, hopefully I've answered that question. Just to say, Rob, we have got a bit of time. It's just before 2:45, so we've probably got time for 3 or 4 more questions.
Yep. Okay. Right. Thank you. That's great. And there were some specific questions for Nick, which I'd quite like to pick up on, but I'm sort of multitasking here, and I'm a bloke, so I'm useless at that. So if anybody can pull out the ones that are specifically for Nick, you know, it'd be nice to bring him back in while we've got him. But there's and other people are very smart. Tactically voting questions up, which are now appearing in the top top questions. So you can, now's your chance to frantically vote up the questions that you think are most burning. So the next question we have, okay, question for Nick. Any idea which has turned out best recently? That's an interesting, wasn't it? Home working and heating, because it has been during this, certainly the latest lockdown has been a pretty cold period, versus commuting, and that is, you know, we're all doing it now, and lots of people intend to carry on working in this new way. But is it carbon beneficial? I think it possibly largely depends on the job. Is that one you can pick up on, Nick? Have you got any reflections? You got any sort of national stats or anything that you could pull to mind?
Thanks. So beyond the graphic that I showed during the talk, I don't have any additional stats to hand. I think on balance, if we look at obviously the impact on emissions, we can say that people sort of staying at home and you know, not commuting but working from home, those that could, obviously not everybody could, probably, you know, does indicate that there is a positive benefit overall in terms of emissions of that shift to home working. Obviously, people are using more energy because they're at home rather than the office, but then obviously the offices are not using as much energy. So I think on balance, yes, we can probably say that it is beneficial to have more home working versus commuting. Also depends on time of year, of course, as well, doesn't it? So people are going to use more heating if they're sitting at home working in the winter. And I think maybe this is one of the reasons that we saw the creeping up again. It's notable that the big drop in emissions was during, I think, certainly in a lot of Europe, a very hot spring as well. So yeah, this will vary throughout the year, but I'd say the evidence does suggest that this will give a sort of net positive benefit if people shift, to more home working.
Yeah.
Can I just?
Yeah, go on.
Sorry,
Annie.
can I just add something to that? Yeah, thank you for that, Nick. I think that also that one of the things that we've had a discussion about with the Norfolk Climate Change Partnership is around that point, because it's a really good one, Jenny, because I think it's very easy to say, oh well, we've reduced emissions because people aren't getting in their cars, but yeah, obviously people are sitting at home. I'm ashamed to say I've got my heating on right now. But one of the things that we've talked about as a kind of group of councils or group of authorities across Norfolk is providing staff with a package, or just a kind of switch to encourage all staff to try and switch to a green energy provider in their homes. So I mean, it's not necessarily the be all and end all, but it's hopefully us trying to address that as well, and recognizing that it's not just a case of saying, well, we've reduced this because we're not doing this anymore, because actually we're all doing something else. But we are going to try and encourage our staff to try and switch in their own homes to energy providers which are better for the environment. So just to add that really to.
Thanks, Annie. Yeah, and actually it's not just about commuting. One of the massively beneficial things is that we can attend meetings without having to travel. So many of you probably don't know that officers from North Norfolk District Council and other district councils throughout the county will frequently be travelling to Norfolk County Council for meetings. So that the journey from Cromer to Norwich by many different officers for many different purposes on many different days, and now we can just have those meetings like this. So I think there are some some real benefits which don't necessarily strictly relate to commuting.
Yeah, go on, Nick. I think this is another good example of these links across sectors, because service transport and buildings are the two biggest contributors to emissions in North Norfolk, and we've already discussed how buildings is a massive contributor, and a lot of that is these old off gas grid homes. So it might be that in particular parts of North Norfolk, or the district as a whole, maybe, and this has been picked up in some of the comments, that you don't get much of a benefit from that shift in terms of emissions if people are sitting in their very energy or emissions inefficient or highly emitting homes, heating them with coal or oil, for example, as opposed to working in these more energy efficient offices. So that's something to be considered. I think we have to look at the details there. And of course, the other thing that we haven't mentioned is that another massive benefit of a shift to home working rather than commuting is a reduction in air pollution and particulates. So there are health benefits there. But I think, as a comment of picking up, it's not a really, really straightforward issue, particularly when we're looking at individual contexts as well. So maybe that's something that we looked at in a bit more detail too. And we need to link the transport commuting issues with the buildings and the energy and emissions issues, for domestic sources.
Yep. Thanks. So there's a sort of global emissions part of that, but there is that local environmental impact emissions issue as well. So sorry, Annie, were you going to come in?
Just to add to that, I mean it's a great question. So there's a lot to pick up on there. But I think one of the interesting things is I've just lost my train of thought. What was I going to say? I've lost my train of thought.
Don't worry.
Sorry.
Okay, right. If you find it again, come back.
Yeah, I'll let you know. Oh no, that was it. Sorry. It's around the behaviour change. I was going to pick up on the point. I know Nick made it really clearly when he spoke, but it's also about trying to enlighten and kind of encourage people to use other options. So for example, I'll use myself. So I live in Norwich, and obviously I've got a job now in Cromer, but actually the majority of the time I'm able to work from home. But I think that around this, it's also about making sure that when people do then need to travel, that they can try and use other options. So for example, when I go to Cromer now, I will use the train because actually 2 days a week, that's really viable. So I think there's an element of this is about trying to stop people from just defaulting back to what they were doing previously, which is really difficult. And I think now is the moment to do it, because I've noticed living in Norwich actually that the roads are really busy again. So you know, it's human nature, isn't it, just to default back to what we've already done. So yeah, just kind of.
So and actually that's an interesting one. It is a you know, there is a need for a sort of blend, and you will be more able to use the train to go to the office, because those meetings that you might have in King's Lynn or somewhere else from the office, you can now do from Cromer. So even if you're more able to get the train to the office because you don't need to leave the office for all of those other meetings. So yeah, there's certainly there's a lot going on. There's a lot of changes that are happening, and probably a lot of changes that are possible. We need to make sure that we exploit the positive ones, and don't go down the wrong avenues. So I'll move on to the next question with one eye on the time. To what extent can the council insist on zero carbon design for new buildings, and will those powers be used to the maximum in local developments? I think it's one for Ian or one of the planning colleagues who may be on. Hey, Ian, are you able to pick up on that one?
Yes, I can. I can pick
tension
up on that
between
one.
building regulations and planning. Maybe you can do that in in the space of 2 minutes.
I can certainly to say it. I'll answer it in two parts. The council, as a developer or as its own organisation, can obviously take whatever path it wishes to do that and set examples and develop where it invests at higher than building regulations and planning policy may stipulate. But when it comes to the local planning authority itself, obviously we have to operate within the parameters of national policy and emerging policy. That said, the local plan is looking at setting quite a challenging target. It's moving from what we had as a previous consultation. We were looking for a 19% reduction in carbon reduction through new development. We're now setting a higher target in the region of 31% reduction. And we can do that because the government have announced in their Future Homes Standard only in January of this year that allows councils to set those more ambitious targets higher than building regulations currently allow. Some of you may say that's not going to go far enough, but it is aligned with the government's intention to update building regulations this year, and in a progressive move through 2023, 24, 25 to achieving in the region of 70 to 80% carbon reduction in building regulations or through building regulations. And coming with that and the intention of decarbonisation of the energy supply, there will be carbon ready or carbon neutral ready, if you like, carbon zero ready even, properties coming forward in the region. And that's the intention at the moment.
Or even carbon negative ones. And actually the transition towards non-fossil fuel domestic energy supplies as well, which is going to be enacted in law. So yeah, there very much are changes which are taking place, but will the council accelerate that? That's our intention. So thanks, Ian. Right, I will move on to, there's a question that's just leapfrogged the one below it. So to what extent can yes, the next question on the list, to what extent can the council insist on they're jumping around in front of my eyes. There was one from Alice. There we are. So how is NNDC looking to the sea to support our environment aims?
Rob, can I just say this will be our last question, because we're fastly approaching 12 o'clock. But what we'll do is if people would like us to, we can try and pull the questions from Slido and send them round after the event today, if that would be useful for people.
I think that would be really good, and actually hopefully we can capture the ones which and the chat, the thread that's going on in the chat as well, which is fascinating, and if we can somehow link that together and provide this after the event, that would be really useful. So Alice's question, which is a great one, we haven't had much about the marine environment yet today. So healthy seas sequester more carbon than on land. So, you know, planting trees is one thing, and rewilding and all of those things. How about the marine environment? How is NNDC looking at that? It's beyond our administrative boundary, but that's a pretty shallow answer. We are trying to develop a relationship with you know, organizations which are concerned about the marine environment. And I mean, you know, MCS is one of them, so the Marine Conservation Society, which Alice represents. So actually, Alice, can you answer your own question in how would you like the council to work to achieve those things?
Hi, yeah, sure. So I guess from a Marine Conservation Society perspective, it's really fantastic that the council is holding this discussion today, and thank you so much for the invite. You know, there are lots of ways that councils can kind of get involved in kind of supporting the health of the local sea. For example, you know, in supporting the kind of like farming aspect. So there's whether it's kind of seaweed aquaculture or you know, even kind of mussel farming, they're all ways that kind of capture carbon, but also kind of, I suppose, increase or rather decrease our kind of reliance on terrestrial kind of farming activity. But another kind of question I have really is around promoting the, I suppose, marine biodiversity and kind of supporting efforts to protect that, and how the council, I suppose, has a vision to kind of support those kinds of things. So apologies to kind of put the question back to you,
Yeah,
but I just wonder if the sea even features in your plans or in your kind of vision to support biodiversity, because I suppose waving the blue flag here, you know, is it even named in your plans?
No, okay, that's a good question. So it's not specifically addressed in the charter, but through our coastal management team and other activities of environmental health team at the council, we do a huge amount to address marine pollution and the causes and the sources of marine pollution, but also in innovative coastal management methods. You know, that we're changing how we manage our coastline enormously, and doing that in more sustainable ways, and sustainable in the broadest sense. Salt marsh, for example, is one of the best forms of sea defense. You know, it can take the energy out of waves and high sea levels, whilst providing a valuable environment and sequestering carbon. So it's yeah, it's a complex question, and it's something which the council, you know, being a maritime local authority, we are concerned that these things should be addressed. We have good relationships with developers of some of those offshore projects that you suggested, such as growing of kelp, etc. So yeah, maybe we can do more, but we're in the process of developing relationships and partnerships, and that's what we would intend to carry on doing. So don't want to brush that one aside, but we are about to run out of time, so I think that just leaves it for me to make some closing comments. So Annie, I don't know whether you want to close the, not that anybody wants to see me particularly, but if you want to close that chat, thank you very much. And so okay, it's been a big week for climate news, and actually in the timing of this event, it is purely coincidental, but the Leaders Summit on Climate, which is currently taking place this week, with some very bold statements from those attending, amongst world leaders, and Earth Day falling yesterday. So it's a good time for us to continue this climate discussion and environment discussion, and a great day for the forum to kind of re-emerge from its pandemic lockdown. So it's against the backdrop of all of this, activity. But we've heard this week also that CO2 emissions are suggested to jump this year to the second biggest annual rise in history. So, there is a somber backdrop to this. The UK is to toughen its targets on greenhouse gas emissions for the next 15 years. And consequently, the government announced earlier this week that CO2 emissions cut of 78% by 2035. An increase from the current target of 68% by 2030. But most of the news has been around a particular football competition, which is quite sad. It's plain to us all that in order to respond to the climate emergency, we have to change. Change is something which many people are uncomfortable with. We're most comfortable when things stay just as they are. But we will have to adapt in order to safeguard the things that we cherish and that are impacted upon by climate change. But we need to change our behaviour in order to slow the rate of global temperature rise as well. And actually, President Biden said just the same thing yesterday. How can we help people to overcome their resistance to change? That's a challenge for us all, but it's a challenge for the council. One way is to scare people. This is something that Nick referred to. You can scare people so that the fear of staying the same can be greater than their fear of change. But that's not going to get the kind of reaction we need. The alternative is to demonstrate the way ahead and the potential future, the potential alternative future, which can be a better one. So now is actually the perfect time, as the global pandemic has created a state of flux and has stimulated positive discussions about behaviour change. And it's perhaps reminded us at how adaptable we actually are as a human species. There's an equation, a sort of management speak equation for overcoming the resistance to change. And it suggests that if dissatisfaction plus a vision of the future plus tangible first steps is greater than the resistance, then people will be more willing to change. So here at North Norfolk, we are committed to changing our own ways of doing things, but also to widening public understanding of the challenges and the risks posed by the climate emergency. By adopting an environmental charter, we hopefully can share our own vision and demonstrate that the council is taking its own first steps through the various actions outlined earlier by Councillor Nigel Lloyd. So what next after this event? We will confirm our charter pledges and take that through the council for adoption. We'll work together with to take necessary actions to ensure that our collective ambitions are achieved. So actually do the doing, to achieve those pledges. Ensure that our dialogue continues through the Environment Forum in a fruitful but challenging way. We'll provide help, support and advice to organisations and businesses which are taking their own action through environmental projects. We'll run a series of online workshops, seminars and further environmental forum events such as this, where we can delve deeper into some of the issues raised today and seek to collectively find answers to some of our biggest challenges and the actions that will be necessary to address them. And immediately after this, we will send out a questionnaire in order to gather feedback on the morning's events and on the emerging environmental charter. So that's what we will do. Lastly, I would like to thank you all for coming along today. We've got tremendous turnout, a virtual turnout, and it's been an absolute joy to hear some of the and read some of the comments that have been made. So thank you all for your time. Thanks to Nick Brooks, Steve Blatch and Councillor Nigel Lloyd for their contributions and their presentations. I'd especially like to thank Annie and Nige and the team for putting this event together, which is a tremendous effort. And to Felix, who's been working really hard behind the scenes to make sure that the techie stuff was all working, and making sure that everything was prepared in advance. So thanks to all of those people. So we hope that, we all hope that after an unprecedented year, that we've been able to re-energise you somewhat and provide the opportunity for you to understand what your council has been up to. And we look forward to further input and help to inform the direction of the actions that we need to take. I don't know whether anybody, perhaps Nigel, very briefly, you'd like to say a quick cheerio to everybody, but I'd just like you to wish you all a lovely weekend and to say goodbye and look forward to the next Environment Forum. Thank you.
I guess you meant Nigel.
Sorry, there's lots of Nigels. I meant you, Nigel. Thank you.
I went through most of my life not knowing another Nigel, and at this stage of my life, everybody seems to be called Nigel. I'd just like to thank everybody for coming. I've been sitting here looking at the chats and the questions on Slido. Absolutely brilliant feedback, enthralling questions too. It just shows how much work we've got to do going forward from here. I'm absolutely pledged to this agenda, and I'm going to do whatever I can as a councillor, a person of influence, if you like, to push this agenda through. And thank you for your support this morning. And thank you to Annie, Nige, Rob. I don't want this to sound like the Oscars, but they've done a great job pulling all this together. Thanks very much for your help. And hopefully we'll have another forum soon. We'll communicate with you. Possibly a slightly different angle next time, but we'll take your feedback on that. So it's way past 12 now, so I'll shut up. But thanks once again for attending this morning. It's been great.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody. Cheerio.
Thank you. Goodbye. Many thanks.
Thank you. Thanks.